Good morning, everyone. This is Jenna. I am the program coordinator at the Long Beach Island Foundation. The beginning of the discussion today is going to look a little different. Usually, Rick Bushnell is our presenter and our gracious host. However, he is unable to join the call today. So I will do my best to take on that role myself and present Joe Smith, who is the lead wildlife biologist for Edwin B. Forsythe National Wildlife Refuge. He's going to be discussing salt marshes off the New Jersey coast today, giving us a general guideline over that and the challenges, restoration strategies, everything like that. I will do my best again to, guide the discussion afterwards as well with Joe. And I do know that his camera is now working today, but his sound is great. His audio looks good. His picture looks good. So without further ado, Joe, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Joe Smith, wildlife biologist at Forsythe National Wildlife Refuge. Our refuge is somewhere about 40,000 acres, spanning various properties along the length of the Barnegat Bay and into Great Bay. And I put up this map here because it really shows the refuge and kind of sketched out in black outlines there, how the refuge kind of is this coastal connection with the Pine Barrens, especially down in the Morris River where the Pine Barrens wilderness connects with this coastal wilderness that goes out to Little Egg Inlet, our completely undredged and natural inlet on the Jersey coast. And yeah, today I'll, because the refuge is 80% salt marsh, that's about how I spend 80% of my time. We've also got some, incredible barrier islands, including Holgate at the south end of Long Beach Island, as well as 10,000 acres of forest. Again, kind of like connecting with the coastal connection with the Pine Barrens. But yeah, I'll be talking about, sort of past uses of the bay and the marshes and how those, affect our current conservation predicaments and how we want to apply our restoration strategies. And I'm sharing this map because I think it's fascinating. This is our topo map, USGS topo maps of one of our back bay salt marsh areas. And the thing that's always fascinated me about this is that there's so many place names on this map. Every little creek and ditch and channel and point has a name, and it tells us something about the past, because I don't think any of us need this level of intimacy with the coastal landscape right now, but it says something about where people where commerce and livelihoods were more tied to these places. It wasn't just recreation or something to look at. That's where these names came from, and I just think about the cartographers and what they had to do to sort of get these names on the map. But yeah, all these livelihoods involve extracting resources from the bay: clams, oysters, fish, waterfowling, and using the marshes for salt hay. Salt hay is a native marsh grass, Spartina patens, and a couple other species that became pretty useful at least in colonial times up till World War II, for feed for animals, but also a few different uses like rope making and paper making, and then today there's a small market for salt hay as a weed-free mulch in gardens. But it's getting harder and harder to get in New Jersey. Lately, I've been hearing people getting it from Massachusetts. There's still some salt hay farming going on out there. This is a present day Forsythe Marsh with that that green, bright green calicky stuff is the grass we're talking about, Spartina patens. So first I'll be talking about our shorelines and how to protect them, and or how we're thinking about protecting them. And one of the interesting things about a lot of our the shorelines of New Jersey Back Bays and Delaware Bay is it's fringed by marsh. And that's interesting because, so many of these shorelines are subjected to a lot of wave action, and marsh is not something that can handle a lot of wave action. Um, and that's evidence here. Here's a marsh change analysis I did for the Atlantic Coast back bays. And what I'm emphasizing here is that we've lost 70% of the marsh we've lost in the last 50 or 60 years to edge erosion. So we're losing it at the edge for the most part. Here we have, that marsh fringe shoreline just with a hunter there in a sneak box. And so, yeah, this is a calm day here, but it's not always calm. And this is the kind of wind-driven wave action that drives erosion of salt marsh. So the mystery is, how do we have so much salt marsh along so much bay when we have so much wind-driven waves? This is a figure that just gets the point across that if you have more than about a 6-inch average wave height, the salt marsh will be eroding. And this is a bank of a salt marsh that's cleaving off that's probably caused by boat wake. And so that's another significant factor in causing erosion out there. I've heard from people that know more about this than me that like the physics of a wave created by a boat is actually more destructive than a wave created by wind. So yeah, so why do we have so much salt marsh exposed to all this wave action? I think it's because our landscape has changed. So the coastal landscape was composed of many features that in the water in the intertidal zone that probably buffered a lot of the salt marsh edge from erosion. That includes oysters and the reefs they can form, beaches, sandy beaches, submerged aquatic vegetation, mainly eelgrass, and tidal flats. And so they all kind of fit together in a mosaic across the landscape, probably to create a coastal defense for the salt marsh. But yeah, as a result of our various uses of the bay and history, we've lost some of these defenses. This is a Swiss cheese graphic I took from this was about like disease prevention. You have different strategies, that nothing, no one strategy stops it, but together, they can present a pretty good defense, and that's how I think of these different features. Like they provide cumulatively a pretty good defense against wave action. And if you don't, if you lose those defenses, you end up in this place where the only thing you can do is put in a hard barrier, against the developed landscape. It's not great for the ecosystem, and it creates a very vulnerable situation for the built landscape. So at least my view is that we've got it's not just sea level rise, but it's like these cumulative human impacts on these various ecosystem components that help accelerate the retreat we might be seeing of the shoreline. And sometimes it's hard to piece together the story or the evidence. Oysters especially, it turns out they're a pretty vulnerable, sensitive species. Like very very vulnerable to overexploitation. And so even in our biggest estuaries like the Chesapeake Bay, in the late 1800s, people were concerned that they were destroying what they had. And as a result, we really don't have a very good description of what it was like before exploitation occurred, because all of this happened so quickly and so long ago. It's really hard to know. In Delaware Bay, it's similar. It's you don't have a clear depiction. This is one description of what it was like kind of in the good old days. And oysters sounds like they were absolutely everywhere, from the shallowest intertidal places, even in the interiors of marshes, all the way out into the bay. where they might have formed reefs. And yeah, and again, these probably played an important role in sheltering the shoreline. The shoreline of the Delaware Bay is truly remarkable in how much marsh fringe shoreline is and how much open water there is leading up to that shoreline. But yeah, I can only really speculate about what this actually looked like, these oyster reefs in the old days, just because exploitation happened so long ago. But here's an example from the southeast where you have oysters and salt marsh growing together, and probably those oysters are helping protect that marsh from erosion there. Um, but in the absence of our ability to restore thriving pre-colonial oyster reefs across the landscape, what you can do is try to mimic the function of those reefs, at least for protecting the shoreline. And that's what these people are doing again in North Carolina, building these shell reefs that hopefully will also get live oysters growing on them eventually. So in some cases, yeah, you may need to use rocks or things that mimic the function of these things we've lost, just to get that benefit. Here we have seagrass. Um, Eelgrass is kind of an iconic species of the Barnegat Bay. Uh, and it's surprisingly something we don't know a whole lot about as far as its mapped extent. I think there's a pretty, consensus that it's declining. But the state is about to put out some updated maps soon, so we'll have a sense of how we're doing out there. And I don't know a whole lot about seagrass, but in reading the literature, it seems pretty clear that it plays a role in reducing the impact of wave action on marshes, reducing the wave height, and then at least in some cases, restoration is working. I think mainly to the south of us in places like Virginia. And the heart of the eelgrass distribution happens to be where like the greatest wave action might be, like the biggest, broadest areas of open water. So it kind of fits like a piece in a puzzle there, in playing that role to help gentle things down in those back bays. But yeah, eelgrass restoration is another challenging task. It's not something that, as far as I know, there's been a lot of progress on in the Barnegat Bay, but yeah, I hope it continues. One thing, just by Googling around, I learned is that there's different opinions on eelgrass, whether it's a nuisance or, it's a vital part of our ecosystem. I guess I'd vote for the vital part of our ecosystem side. There's certain species associated with, like bay scallops are associated with eelgrass, and those are commercially not viable in the bay anymore, I don't think. So yeah, just part of the diversity of the bay and play that key ecological role. And so, we've kind of lost a lot of the functional role of oysters and seagrass. We still have tidal flats out there. And it's mostly to the south of the Barnegat Bay, mainly toward Atlantic and Cape May counties. We have pretty extensive mudflats that are really important shorebird habitat, things like red knots and many other species. But they also play a role in sheltering the shoreline. I did my own. There's my angry sea picture again. But I did my own analysis of how much erosion along the marsh shoreline changes as wind exposure changes, and it's what I would expect is that the bigger areas of open water, that's where the marsh is eroding the most. But then I found where if there happens to be a tidal flat present, and if it's a wide one, it protects that edge. So yeah, tidal flats can play a role and many of these tidal flats in these back bays, they were also mapped on those old USGS maps, and I'm really surprised to see that they're very static features out there. It's not like they're moving all around and stuff. They're they're like kind of in the same place over long periods of time. But I can imagine using this idea of flats protecting shorelines to, potentially nourish areas, raise elevations at the bottom and, to protect shorelines I'll talk more later, but, dredge material use is becoming uh, kind of one of the main tools to sort of work, rework the coastal landscape, the ecological landscape. And at least other parts of New Jersey, they have tried creating tidal flats with dredge material. Beaches, of course, we have our Atlantic coast beaches, but we have, little beaches along the bays as well, back bays as well. And these do an incredible, they play an incredible role in protecting, the marshy shoreline from erosion. So here you see a marsh that is fringed by a beach. But then I have shoreline discontinuities, essentially like openings in the shoreline. Here is like an old mosquito ditch. What I've learned is they capture sand and they sort of help the sand leave the beach. So the more of these like artificial openings you have, the less the less robust the beach will be over time, especially if there's not new sand coming in. And that's the case for the back bays, is there's not a whole lot of fresh sand coming in. Most of the sand that's back there probably came from barrier island breaches or like geological timescale processes, but so there's no fresh sand coming in, and so if you're losing sand off your beach, it's hard for it to come back. And this is just an analysis I did showing how many more shoreline openings we have on that western shore of the Barnegat Bay. And yeah, each of these could potentially, suck up some of the sand that would otherwise be along the beach, because you have these kind of shoals that form off of these inlets. And, ironically, that some of those shoals become our dredging problem. So like you have an inlet going into a lagoon community. You have sand collecting in that inlet. That sand is probably from the shoreline. So yeah, once again, dredging sand, if we can put it back on those beaches, that would be kind of a renewable, cyclical, process to protect their shorelines. And so this is a very rough estimate I did for mapping, but a small fraction of the bay beaches we had in 1930 remain today. But yeah, as I alluded to, we have the technology to put sand back on these shorelines. Here's one small project at our refuge where we're bringing in sand from a sand mine, but we have another project elsewhere on the refuge where we did use dredge sand and put it back on a marsh fringe shoreline. And the dredging thing is these waterways, so there's state channels, federal channels, municipal channels, marinas, all these things are getting dredged one way or another. Over at least through the 20th century, most of this material went into upland sites. But we're broadly understanding that this is the raw material that makes up these, beaches, dunes, salt marsh, mudflats. And if we're constantly taking it away, the ecosystem has less to work with. So, we're still, the practices are still forming and evolving to use this material in the best way, that does the least impact to the ecosystem and the most benefit. But we're certainly on our way on a few projects at the refuge. Okay, and here's where we get into salt marsh, talking about the salt marsh itself and the things that affect it. And, one of the most sort of interesting historically, but most damaging practices that happened on salt marsh was actually farming the marshes. And so folks farmed the marshes in various ways. In some cases, they would just put in ditches and mow the native marsh grass, drain it, drain the marsh to some degree, and mow the native marsh grass, either with starting with horses and things like that, and graduating to tractors. But then there are also large-scale impoundment of marshes. So basically creating a dike all around the marsh, draining it to further control, conditions inside, grow better crops. But this caused, pretty serious problems for the marsh. This is in Delaware Bay, where about 50% of the marshes out there on the New Jersey side were impounded. and drained for farming. And in some of these places, if the water was brackish or fresh enough, they could grow upland crops. So here's a place on the Morris River that today is a salt marsh. But then this is a map of a farm, and it came with a key. So all these different like hatched areas represent things like corn, strawberries, potatoes, and upland hay. Um, so these were really productive places to grow, whatever you could grow. Um, and it and yeah, it achieved a large scale in Delaware Bay, smaller scale in the Barnegat and New Jersey Back Bays. But also was places like this is an image from maritime Canada where they have vast areas of impounded marsh that they maintain today. Up there, the government actually helps maintain the infrastructure, whereas down here in New Jersey, it was up to private individuals and consortiums, and it's all gone away at this point. Also in the Carolinas for rice, there were major impoundments. But I think most of those have gone by the wayside. But here's the problem with impounding a marsh or ditching it or really changing anything about the hydrology is that when you dry out a marsh, the material that marsh is made of that makes its elevation and is peat, and it's decomposable. So whenever you expose that decomposable peat to oxygen, it decomposes and disappears basically. And so you lose elevation. So here's a really nice illustration of an impoundment. This is from the Everglades. So it just happens anywhere you have peat soil that you try to farm. And it's very productive soil because it's so, richly organic. But it doesn't last for long before you start completely losing elevation. And if you're in these, tidal environments, it becomes harder and harder to get the water out of there as it gets lower and lower. You might have to resort to pumps. Your dikes are always threatened by storms. And so at some point, you have to give up on it. So it's not a really sustainable practice. And so that's so all the farmed marshes in Delaware Bay have been given up on, and they are either are or aren't marsh now, depending on how low they got. But these marshes, this is an analysis I did that where they lost about 2 to 3 feet um, of elevation, and so that's a lot to ask for a marsh. That's lost 3 feet to still persist, and so there are some marshes that we've lost entirely because of this, and some that are just very low, kind of like what you might imagine a marsh looks like after 3 feet of sea level rise. That's kind of what we're seeing out there today. Um, but yeah, so so these practices did happen in one way or another um, on the Atlantic coast, but there were only a few big like impounded areas. Otherwise, it was sort of like areas adjoining uplands where farmers extended their farms out into the marsh. Here's a really cool example. The refuge owns an area of Barnegat that is mostly open water now. It was an impounded marsh farm. Because of the impoundment, it's now open water, and it presents a big challenge for us to think about restoring. But yeah, it was still an active farm in 1974, and you can see the mowed areas and the hay bales. So those are bales of marsh grass, Spartina patens. But yeah, that's and then you can see in the foreground there the dike keeping out the water, and then the surrounding channel that is for drainage. Here's just another example. This is more like the upland adjoining farm. So farm in 1930, still being worked. But then today, it's kind of the worst condition marsh we have in this area. And so this is, yeah, just a good example of the challenges we're facing on the refuge is, how to keep these marshes um, sustainable and, sort of keeping up with sea level rise and providing the diverse habitats that the wildlife need. Um, so sort of dealing with these past impacts and then dealing with, how things are changing in the present and future tense. The other hassle and the other impact to the marshes has been ditching, and I've been researching this one a lot. But about 80% of our marshes in the Northeast are ditched, and I've been trying to understand, what exactly this did to our marshes. It's less like its effects are much more subtle than the impoundment, where you're losing feet of elevation. But yeah, the effects are, I think, still profound. Um, so yeah, a lot of our refuge is ditched, although we're really lucky to have some unditched marshes, which I'll show you in a little bit. Um, and a resource that I really enjoyed digging into was the proceedings of the New Jersey Mosquito Association, where I got some of these great images. It started in the early 1900s. They have an annual report, full of conversations at meetings and sort of standalone articles. Um, and New Jersey is kind of like the headquarters of the ditching practice. It was kind of led by the state entomologist John Smith, who advocated for large scale parallel ditching of the marshes. So every 50 feet or so, just cut a ditch across the whole thing. Um, oh, there's the Mosquito Association meeting. That's their 28th meeting. I can't quite see the date. It must be the 30s or 40s. And they have this meeting to this day in Atlantic City. So every year, I'm sure they're not as formally dressed, but you can still attend this meeting. Um, but yeah, I was trying to learn what were they trying to achieve with the ditching, and it was mainly they wanted to get rid of these ponds that are a natural feature on these unditched marshes. They're little isolated ponds that they thought produced mosquitoes. It turned out that the mosquitoes don't actually breed in these ponds. Um, but nonetheless, they eliminated many thousands of ponds, and so the mosquitoes actually breed in the dry marsh. So that the mosquitoes lay their eggs on the highest part of the marsh, and then when there's a flood or a rainstorm, it makes these little pockets of water that the larvae hatch out in. So that's actually where the mosquitoes breed. Here's a ditch cleaning machine. So that once they dug the ditches, they had to clean them because they would start silting in on their own because the marsh is trying to heal itself basically. And here's the offending ponds, what they look like, sometimes wet, sometimes dry, sometimes completely filled with wildlife. And my interest in these is that they're really attractive to wildlife, an important feature driving like the diversity of life on these marshes. Um, but yeah, they were pretty adamant about getting rid of every last pond out there. Um, but at the time, it's really interesting. Again, maybe only to me, but the conservation history of this practice is really interesting. There were people that were sounding the alarm in the 30s, like this is a bird expert, just pointing out like all these diversity of features, depths of ponds and salinities. It's just, the more diversity you have, the more diversity of life you have out there. Um, and so people were making the call to like the stitching is causing problems for wildlife. But that call wasn't heeded for a while. This is a mosquito person kind of, realizing that, they were having impacts on these ponds and wildlife habitat, especially for ducks. So waterfowl hunters were the ones that were really leading the protest. Um, but nonetheless, it basically continued unabated. Um, by the 1950, there was this guy published a paper, Clarence Cottam. He worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the same agency I work for, and studied a marsh for 10 years um, in Delaware, that before it was ditched and after. And he documented all these interesting patterns. It's the only study of its kind because once again, all this ditching happened so quickly and so long ago, and it wasn't like there was a bunch of scientists hanging around to study the effects. So it's few and far between these understanding these impacts and studies that focus on it. But this guy really did a great job. And what he documented was when you dry out a marsh, the vegetation changes. It changes to a vegetation that likes drier habitats. But he also documented elevation loss. Um, I mean, using his 1940s technology, documented elevation points all over this marsh before and after, and found the marsh lost about 4 to 6 inches of elevation. Again, not 2 to 3 feet, but I think important. And here's just a recent study that shows that those elevation deficits created by ditching are still out there. This is a marsh in Cape Cod where they had the benefit of an unditched marsh to compare things to. So now we're into 1950, where everybody's kind of agreeing that ditching caused problems. Salt marshes that not subjected to man-made changes can be highly productive of wildlife. We should leave our salt marsh ponds alone. At this point, most of the salt marsh ponds had already been lost. But for me, this is the motivating thing: is to, if we can, restore our marshes to the condition they were before they were ditched, and bring back that highly productive habitat for wildlife. This is just an illustration I made to try to give you a sense of the how things changed. This is a unditched marsh with diverse habitat features, diverse elevations, diverse hydrological features. Some ponds connected to channels, some ponds isolated, small channels, big channels. But yeah, when you have the parallel ditching across the marsh, it eliminates those ponds. It kind of like averages out the elevation because the ponds are gone. Those are the lows, and then the high areas are gone because of elevation loss. And so you just have a medium elevation marsh that, from my experience being out on these marshes, they're boring. They're more boring than the unditched marsh. A lot less life on them, and I think they're also like more vulnerable to degradation. And one of the patterns of degradation we see is actual new ponds forming on these old ditch marshes, but these are not like, these are kind of troublesome ponds because they fill the entire marsh. It's because the marsh lost elevation, and then the ditches aren't maintained anymore because the mosquito agencies realized it wasn't doing any good anyway. And so, like, the maintenance of the ditches, so they're starting to fill in, and the marsh is becoming wetter. And so, yeah, you start to get these ponds forming, especially in the northern Barnegat Bay, where the tidal range is very small. And so any sort of impact to the marsh is felt to a greater degree where you have a smaller tide swing. And so a lot of our restoration work is focusing in the northern Barnegat Bay and areas like this, where you're getting these big areas of open water. Yeah, let's see. We had 100,000 acres of marsh in 1970. I think I showed this already. So yeah, just on average, we've lost about 6% of our marshes, which is not, alarming to me. Like it's not, we're not losing it, at least up to date, up to this point, we're not losing it in a dramatic way, just incremental. But what we are losing in a dramatic way is that Spartina patens grass I was talking about, the salt hay. So just 6% of marsh loss overall, but we've lost this Spartina patens grass by 50%. So 50% of the coverage has been lost. And that's because because the marshes are becoming wetter, and they're converting to a marsh that's a lower elevation grass, the Spartina alterniflora. And so this is important because marsh nesting birds really depend on the Spartina patens habitat that you're looking at here. This is in an unditched marsh. So it's black rail, which is a federally endangered species, nests in it, as well as salt marsh sparrow. That's a candidate for listing. About 30% of all the salt marsh sparrows in the world are in New Jersey, and then the salt marsh sparrow range only goes from Maine to Virginia, breeding range, and they're only in salt marshes. Here's some good news. So once again, from the Proceedings of the Mosquito Association, in 1917, they mapped out all the marshes they hadn't ditched yet, and that's all these ones that are in black. And then what I have in green is the marshes they never got to. So these are all the marshes that are still unditched. And out of the Northeast, I think we have the most unditched marshes of any state, about 50,000 acres. People elsewhere in the region don't believe me when I tell them we have all this unditched marsh, but it's true. And it's an incredible resource for really understanding how these marshes work, how they work as wildlife habitat, and as models for restoration, what we want to turn marshes into. So here's a comparison. We've got, yeah, our beautiful, this is an actual federal wilderness area, the Motts Creek Marsh Wilderness Area on the right there. That's unditched at the mouth of the Mullica River. And then I've been comparing it to this ditch counterpart. And well, first off, you can see, the density of channels that were imposed by ditching. And you can imagine, yeah, the effect that has had. Here's the elevation. So we can see all these elevation differences today on these beautiful digital elevation models made from LiDAR. And so what you can see here on the right is you got a lot more light green. That's the high elevation stuff. And on the right, you've also got a lot more blue, which is ponds mostly. So more low elevation, more high elevation. And then on the ditch side, it's just medium, just average all across. And um, yeah, I think this has big implications for wildlife diversity out there. It's something I'm working on documenting the diversity of bird species in one area versus the other. The other fascinating thing is that that Spartina patens grass that declined by 50% coast-wide, it hasn't declined in this unditched area, which tells us something, something right is happening there, something, it's a good model for the way we want other marshes to work. And yeah, it declined about 24% in this ditched counterpart. And so essentially what we want to, bring back with, in these ditch marshes is topographic diversity, like, getting those high elevation areas back out there, reducing the density of some of these channels. A lot of these channels are filling in on their own, but, helping them fill in. And yeah, and letting some ponds reform on their own, maybe not dig new ones, but letting them reform on their own as they will. But yeah, to get to a resilient coastal landscape that, protects the shoreline and, is functioning, beautifully. Yeah, we got to, think about putting all these pieces of the puzzle back together. This is an example from Delaware Bay, but could apply anywhere. But you think about things that shelter the shoreline and then, repairing the shoreline itself and then the marsh as well. And to achieve a result that, gets at all these points, this is something I pulled from a salt marsh restoration manual from England. But yeah, it seemed to like sort of hit a lot of the points that I'm thinking about. But yeah, of course, the question is how to achieve all this. And we're, just taking small steps, as a refuge, but also as a conservation community working with, other nonprofits and agencies. And, there's a whole group of folks working on these ideas and testing them. But yeah, I think about it as, addressing these human impacts as well as thinking about storms and sea level rise. And like here you've got imported material, like I mean, I think at least one of the mediums that we work in at the moment is dredge material because there's so much dredging, especially in the Atlantic Coast back bays in New Jersey. And then the Army Corps of Engineers, for example, has sort of made a goal of using 70% of their material beneficially rather than just take it away somewhere, find a beneficial use for it. Here's just an example of a marina being dredged this winter near a site on our refuge where we're using that dredge material to basically fill in. You can see all these open water areas, sort of what kind of a real life depiction of what I was describing earlier. Um, and then this area got silt placed in it, and hopefully this will sort of become a fully vegetated lower marsh area. something we, it's something, I'm seeing across our different projects, like so the idea is to use dredge material to, build up marsh. We've had probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 projects, in the Northeast, and I've visited many of them. And, some of them are almost 10 years old. And the paradox is what our goal is to create high elevation marsh habitat. Like I was telling you, like that's what we lost, especially that Spartina habitats. But the paradox is these are very slow to recover. So when you actually put dredge material at that elevation, it doesn't do very well. And dredge material does very well at a lower elevation where it's wet and more regularly. That species that's in that area, Spartina alterniflora, really knows how to colonize fresh bare material. It does really well. But yeah, this is the paradox is like this, the species that like this elevation don't do well on the dredge material. And here's just a few pictures of that from, this is from Rhode Island. And you just have these zones and different projects that this might be, this is New Jersey on the refuge. But yeah, these areas that are just like sort of biological deserts for, I don't know, longer than I would like. I'd like more immediate results than waiting, 10 or who knows how many years for things to recover. The interesting thing is if you go high, um, vegetation grows back pretty quickly, but it's not really marsh anymore. It's more like a dune-like environment. This is Rhode Island. And so, if you're, in this case, they put this material on living marsh. And so if you're doing that to living marsh, like it's a big trade-off to give up, what that marsh is doing for, whatever benefit you may get down the line. So at any rate, like what we're thinking of is using the dredge material as a to fill the low places, but realize that making high elevation habitat is not um, going to get it, going to get there for us. We've got species that are declining. We can't wait for the habitat to form over some decadal timeline. Um, Here's an example of placing material at those lower elevations and where it comes back pretty quickly. This is on the Delaware Bay. So after 4 years, it was fully vegetated. So how do we get this stuff? I'm just going to conclude here with just one more like restoration vignette. Um, we've been testing out different materials, with this idea like, oh gosh, we can't get this high marsh species to grow. So we had a dredge placement project on our refuge about 5 years ago. And, I set up plots with experimental plantings. Yeah, and sure enough, the Spartina patens grass died, within the first season. Um, so it just wasn't working. So I started to try new ideas, like let's try experiments, basically. So I tried dredge silt, sand from an upland, and then compost that they make at the dump from leaves that they collect from households. We did a bunch of measuring the growth, watching them grow over time, below ground biomass, pH, all kinds of stuff, and but it became obvious we didn't have to measure anything. It became obvious that this compost was the grass was really thriving in it, especially the Spartina patent. So we stumbled upon what seemed like a good idea. And so we've just continued to run with it as best we can, given our resources. Just testing for greenhouse gas emissions just to make sure it's not, some weird thing isn't happening with the compost reacting with the environment. But just kept moving with it, making larger features like this one. This is a couple pickup truck loads planted with Spartina patens and with some erosion control cloth, biodegradable erosion control cloth. We just did one of these and watched it grow through a season. This is a couple years ago, and it did great. This is 2 years later. We made a little marsh just by throwing a little compost in the water there. So this is another one of these marshes it used to be grass in the 90s, and now it's mostly water. And then we had the opportunity to just scale up a little bit, and we did 200 more of these things using an airboat to drop off our little mounds. And it's not enough to save this marsh, but it's enough to continue learning and experimenting with the idea, in hopes of continuing to scale up and just doing a little bit year after year and maybe making a dent in things. So yeah, same process, but we just did it 200 times. Got a lot of volunteer help from different, you know, volunteers and then people working with other organizations helping us get this done. And yeah, everything's so far so good. And to me, the compost is an exciting idea because it's a renewable resource that, they're making more each year. At least our relationship with Ocean County is great. They're willing to share, the material and help us along with this idea. So it's been a great process so far. And I think I'll leave it at that. It's just a few more photos of our marsh. We did a little bit larger area too. That's going well. And yeah, thanks for letting me share today. I look forward to talking a little bit more with y'all about all this.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joe. This is Darlene, and I see that we have some questions in the chat section. I'm not sure if you're able to read those or not.
Okay, let me check.
One is from Bill. Near the top, are the ditches still maintained? If not, how come they are not filling in by themselves? Has any attempt been made to fill in the ditches since they have nothing to do with mosquitoes? Some of these questions you answered as the talk went on, but is there anything you want to address for Bill's question there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the ditches are filling in some cases on their own. And then yeah, in other cases, it's something we want to pursue is trying to, fill them in and get the hydrology out there, the channel network back to a more natural condition. So I think that would be the ideal thing is to fill some of the ditches and then use some of the, that compost material or to sort of create those high elevation areas and create the habitat areas that we want to bring back.
Thank you. And then Terry has a question for Joe, please. Can salt marsh hay be planted? Will they survive? And if so, best planting is where?
Yeah, it can be planted. It's a really versatile species. It grows in dunes, just as well as it grows in salt marshes, so it can handle very dry conditions as well as, the salt marsh conditions. I've grown it in my yard, in pots. So, you can just water with fresh water. It just gets outcompeted, I think, in the upland environment, like the garden environment. But yeah, there's certain places like in this, restoration context, it certainly does not like this dredge material. I just think it's just too hostile an environment, and it gets maybe too salty, too anoxic, not enough oxygen, things like that. But at any rate, this compost seems like a great growing medium for it.
And best planting is where?
Well, I'm not sure where you're thinking of planting it, but its natural sort of position is like in the high elevation parts of the marsh where it's only flooded. It's got to be flooded about 15% of the time or less. So it really like needs its roots to get some air. But yeah, that would be the situation it grows in. And once again, it also grows in dunes.
Oh, keep your questions coming because we still have about 10 minutes. And here's one from Jennifer. I'm always amazed that marshes seem to thrive near highly developed areas. How do they differ from tidal marshes? Do they have other challenges?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the development presents challenges for marshes, but yeah, yeah, we have this, incredible landscape in the Barnegat Bay where it's highly developed, but there's all these beautiful natural areas, sometimes intertwined. And certainly, yeah, some of these, impacts of the, pollution, things like that, cause problems, but yeah, the marsh persists. And then we have this, especially in the Barnegat Bay, we've got a gradient um, from fresh to, from brackish to salt, or at least we historically did. It's one part I left out. But in the upper Barnegat Bay, it was very, it was almost like a freshwater habitat. But the Point Pleasant Canal brought in salt water from the north. and kind of completely change the ecosystem up there. It's another just sort of interesting tidbit that's been a little bit forgotten, like this sort of ecological shift. But yeah, it's, you know, really diverse ecosystem out there, like as far as like the different conditions, tidal ranges, salinities, you know, from north to south.
All right, in Ship Bottom, we have areas where eel grass has taken over. If we wanted to grow salt marsh hay, then when healthy, plant it like your team has. How do we obtain best practices for growing on land first, then into the Bay areas?
Wow, yeah, there's a lot of interest in growing salt hay. Uh, yeah, I mean, around, you know, around your property or something like that, you know, it's well, number one, you know, working in this intertidal area, like anything you do, requires permits. You know, you got to get an Army Corps of Engineers permit, state permit. So all this stuff that I'm talking about, like we're doing on the ground, you know, requires this permitting process. And I think it's the same for any landowner. And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. And you know, in these conversations about, you know, trading one habitat for another, you know, like bay versus marsh, like that's kind of a ongoing sort of negotiation. So yeah, it's tricky. Um, but yeah, around, you know, around an individual property, yeah, I'd say, you know, the one, I'm not sure where to get Spartina Payton's. Like the one group we work with is Pinelands Nursery, but they're a wholesale nursery, but I'm sure there are other nurseries that sell it.
What's kind of going through my head, Joe, is are there individual steps that people on the island, in particular on the bay side and the mainland, can take to help with some of this restoration? If it's kind of on their own dime, going out and purchasing things, learning how to plant them, is there anything else that we can do to help?
No, it's something I have to think about more, like and you know, sort of get understand people's context. So like if we're talking about, you know, backyards, or are we talking about, you know, like yeah, like sort of you know, at, you know, larger scale work. I mean, what's nice about Long Beach Island is, you know, they are engaged, you know, the municipality is engaged in these types of restorations. So maybe get in touch with them, like the Science Center down in Holgate, for example. You know, those folks are actively, you know, have funded projects to sort of design restoration projects and shoreline protection projects. Um, so yeah, that may be an option there.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Terry, for sending that. And I agree. I think many of the people who tune into these sessions for Science Saturday are already inclined or already doing really neat things on the island to help protect it. So anything new that we can help point them to is great. And also hearing from you all too about things that you're already involved in. You can put that in chat. You can, you know, email us anytime too. But I'll put a simple email in here that will be sent when we send a recording of this. Question for Don. There is currently a plan to restore a marsh in northern Barnegat. Let me just scroll up. Bay, known as the Nellie Bennett Marsh. The plan is to use dredge spoil to elevate the marsh, which is considered a win-win for the town. Sounds like a dredge spoil does not work well. Should the plan consider mulch instead?
No, yeah, I'm familiar with that project, and I think it's you know, it's a good. So the way I'm thinking of this dredge material, it works really well if you you know, place it at elevations where it's regularly flooded, and then um, if you place it at higher elevations, you know, it may eventually become marsh. And that's maybe a trade-off that's okay, like because Nellie Bennett, for example, is like almost disappeared, you know, so it's not, so it's like there are trade-offs with using dredge material, and some of these projects you're basically building something out of nothing. In other places, you've already got a marsh and you're working with that, and so there's just different considerations. But overall, I mean, dredge material is a great, you know, sort of tool for salt marsh restoration work. It's just like as we get into the nuance, like there are these trade-offs.
Okay, I have a question for me. Thank you. Jennifer, that's a great question. Their West Coast counterpart is a project called Coast. I'm just going to put that in the link here. and our East Coast version of tracking dead birds that are dying and then starting to draw some, looking at data of why that might be happening. If there are patterns emerging, often come from another very popular citizen science app called iNaturalist. And I would encourage everybody to look at that because you can see other people who have documented important biodiversity, and over time you'll see changes. There's just millions of people who are documenting that, and they have a lot of professional volunteers even, who come in and can help identify the actual species. So that's research quality grade data that ends up being shared through the iNaturalist platform. So that, for me, Jennifer, that's the first place I would look, is iNaturalist. And then for the link I have there, Coast is an actual citizen science project where people look at dead seabirds, and they have scientists try to figure out what the heck is going on, if anything. And you're welcome. This is from Arlene. Is there a contact you can provide for issues we are recently experiencing on the Metadeconk?
Metadeconk?
Thank you.
I'm not sure what the issues are. I mean, the refuge definitely has some salt marsh up there, and it's some of the most degraded salt marsh in the whole Barnegat Bay. Kind of as you go from south to north, it gets kind of a little bit worse, again, because of the tidal range issues and potentially because of that Point Pleasant Canal that changed it from a brackish to a saltwater ecosystem. That happened back in the 40s. But anyway, I'm not sure what the issues are, but
where would Arlene turn to either learn a little bit more or maybe contact somebody if she feels that there are issues that she's observing?
yeah, I'm not, maybe Save Barnegat Bay. They're a nonprofit, focused on conservation of the bay.
Seems like a good place to start. And then also, Arlene, if you tune in next week too, I think it's nice to have the feedback. If you reached out and heard something, if any of you went to the Coast website or uploaded things through the citizen science projects, it's neat to hear your observations too, because that's part of the goal here is we have the presentation. So Joe, that was great. I learned so much more than I anticipated through your talk. So thank you. And now we have an opportunity with that framing and maybe more informed on things to be able to start to fill in the blanks or address new questions in the next event too. Algae blooms and a terrible summer stench. Oh, that's okay. There you go. Arlene's pointing out what she has observed and heard.
Yeah, that is not something I'm familiar with, but yeah, could be related to sort of pollution issues. But yeah, probably Barnegat Bay Partnership or Save Barnegat Bay would be two groups to contact to understand more.
Great. So we're at the end of our time here. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Joe, thanks for a wonderful presentation. We will send an email follow-up. Thank you, Jenna at LBIF. Anybody who registered receives a link to the recording and links that we talked about here today too. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks, Darlene. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.